Hi there, Lindsay here. Welcome to Sketchbook Sunday. This is my weekly time lapse where I work on something that is kind of different and challenging for me. And this is an acrylic painting, believe it or not. And it was a lot of fun to do. So hopefully the steps here can help you kind of maybe break out of a painting block, maybe get some of those canvases used, and I hope it inspires you. The real-time version of this is up in Critique Club. I'll have a link in the video description for you to check that out, and I'll talk a little bit more about Critique Club later. But first of all, I want to get into the basis of what we're doing here on the canvas. I've got a stencil here with a very light and airy design. It's by Juggles. I picked it up at the stamp show, but you should be able to find that on their website. And what I'm doing here is just adding a little bit of pattern to the corners. Notice that I'm not going over the edge because then I'd have this kind of ugly square around it. And I don't want that. I want a kind of an organic edge, and I'm feathering off any globby paint at the edges just to give it a soft look. So it's a great technique when you want to integrate a few different patterns, or you just want something to look kind of ethereal and lost and found. What I'm using to apply my paint here are cosmetic sponges. You can totally wash these out before the paint dries and use them over and over again. But if you forget and you notice you have a crusty little sponge there on your hands, what you can do is actually just take scissors and cut off that crusty bottom part, and then you can keep on using the sponge. So you don't need to throw it away if you forget and let paint dry in it. Now, a pattern like this, a polka dot, usually tessellates, which means it repeats. So you can lay the pattern on top, again, line it up, and you can cover a humongous area with one stencil, even though it's small. Think about that when you're using your stencils and when you're purchasing stencils. Think about how you might use them to cover a large area, because smaller stencils are so much easier to store and more convenient to work with. So if you find something that you can kind of move around and use like I'm doing here with these stencils, you're going to use them a lot more because there's going to be a lot more options of what you can do. Just try not to go right to the edge of your stencils, and you shouldn't have any awkward, weird frames around them to deal with. Now, something I also like to do, speaking of frames, is when I'm doing these backgrounds, I try to build up some color and pattern at the edges of my canvas. And what this does is it gives me the opportunity to hang this without a frame, which can save you boku bucks and let you enjoy your paintings a lot sooner, by the way. Because, I mean, don't we always get kind of hung up with framing? It's, for some reason, it seems like to be the biggest obstacle to get our pictures in a frame and on the wall. Now, what I'm doing here is a tip that I learned from my friend Cinnamon Cooney. She does her sketching before she acrylic paints with watercolor pencils. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. So I stole it, and I'm using that idea here. And the nice thing about this is that you're not going to have these ghosty pencil lines through. What's going to happen is when you go and paint, it's going to dissolve the watercolor pencils. So what I'm doing here is painting around the lilies that I just drew to kind of tone down the background a little bit, so they won't be competing directly with the lilies right there. And I'm using, I didn't thin down the paint, but I'm using the paint in a really thin layer so that I can see some of the pattern below, but I just don't want to have it, I don't want to have it completely wiped out, but I don't want to have it really aggressive right behind my flowers. Then I just added a little bit of magenta into that white paint, and I'm just giving my flowers a really thin base coat, basically just so I can see where they are, because they've kind of gotten gobbled up in the background, and I want to make sure I know what I'm looking at when I'm looking at my canvas. The version of this painting that's in Critique Club is about 2 hours long and is really in-depth, so you will go through step by step as I'm working with this. And if you don't know what Critique Club is, it's a monthly membership group. It's $5 a month, and it allows you to upload 2 paintings a month so that you can get a personal critique or feedback from me on how you can improve them. So this is for people that want to grow and improve their artwork and want a little bit of help along the way on their own personal art journey. And I welcome anybody, no matter what your level is, to join if you want to grow, or if you just want these bonus tutorials. I post 2 tutorials every month that are a little bit more experimental but advanced and longer, ones that just wouldn't do very well on YouTube and aren't specific enough for a particular class. So it just kind of gives you a little bit more in-depth learning than would be possible in either of those other 2 spaces. Some people just join for the tutorials, some people just join for the feedback, and some people enjoy both, and all are welcome. So if that's something that'd be interested to you, I'll link it down below, and you can learn more on that page on my website. I also did a base coating of the stems just so I'd have a good idea of where they are. Now that I'm going into painting the leaves, what I'm doing is doing a coat of white, a thick coat of white paint, then I'm adding some magenta in towards the center, and then I'm blending it out. Now what you use to blend is completely up to you. I used a small fan brush, that worked pretty well. Filberts also work really well too. You just basically want to soften that paint so you get kind of a rouge effect from the intense color in the center to the white on the edge of the petals. And then I added a little bit of Naples yellow towards the bottom and drag that up to warm up the base of the petal and to make it look a little bit more like the lily that I'm trying to create. Now at this stage when I'm putting out paint, I'm just putting out small amounts because I don't want to waste it. I took a little bit of violet that I used in the background, added a little bit of the yellow to it and the magenta, and a little bit of blue, and I made myself a neutralized gray. Now you can use whatever colors you want to make your gray. Try to use things you've already used in your painting, or if that's just a real big pain, you could use gray from a bottle. Just try to mix it with something else so you harmonize it, because gray on its own is probably not going to be exactly the right fit, but if you add a little bit of maybe your green from your leaves and your pink from the center of the flower, that's going to make it match. It's going to make it feel like it belongs there. So if neutralizing colors or mixing isn't your thing, if you feel like you're wasting tons and tons of paint when you're mixing, take a color that you have that's a closest and just add some other colors you've been using to it to give it that harmony that you need. It'll make your work look so much more professional. Then after you get those colors blended to your liking, you can add the spots, which in this case are a magenta color. Add the spots last because if you still want to fuss in there and blend, then you're just going to smear those spots out and that could be kind of frustrating, or you're going to paint over them and then you'll need to repaint them again. So they are definitely a last step situation. I'm going to do another petal here when we're zoomed in, and then we'll skip ahead a little bit to save some time. So again, we're doing a coat of white all over everything, a nice thick coat. And the reason we do a thick coat is because it's going to stay wetter longer. When you add water to your acrylic, it actually makes it dry faster because you're spreading it out, you're thinning it. If I paint a real thin coat, it's going to dry faster. Just like when you're painting your walls, you do a couple of thin coats because, it can dry quicker between coats. Well, here I'm putting a thick coat in because I want it to stay wet and I want to be able to blend that magenta in there. I'm doing the same thing with the grays. I'm just looking for where I've got the shadow, and it tends to be underneath where you have an overlapping petal, and also on the ruffles and curls on the edge of the petals. I had way too much water on my brush there. I think I had a bead of water that slid down the ferrule and gave me some grief there. And what happens when you get that water on your acrylic paint is it wants to lift up what's underneath. So it's very problematic when that happens, and it's very frustrating because it just wants to undo all the work that you've done. So after you've rinsed your brush off, just wipe the handle, blot it, make sure you've got that extra water out so you don't end up thinning down your paint and having issues with it drying too quick for you, which is kind of it feels opposite. Like, why adding water? It's making it dry quicker. That's crazy. Here you can see I've done that same technique to all the petals, and it's looking a lot more polished. I also added some of that that blue to my green and put that in the center. Now I've got this light spring green color there. I used some of the blue from the background and just made that little darker green to go in the middle of the flower for depth. Now, I just like to kind of fuss around a little bit with my shadows. I find it adds a lot of depth, and especially where we've got a light background right now, it's going to help pull that flower off the background. Now, I'm going to show you how you can pop those flowers off the background towards the end of the video, but for right now, I was wondering if maybe I could keep them light and keep the background the way it is. But don't worry, you're never done if you don't think it's done. If you're not happy with it, you're not done. You can keep doing more. Acrylic is very forgiving in the fact that you can paint over it. And although I don't work with acrylic very much, I really enjoy doing this project and I enjoyed using these paints. These are Royal Nickel acrylics. They're the ones in the larger tubes. And I found they performed pretty well. They remind me a lot of the Liquitex Basics line. They're not quite as heavy as the heavy-bodied Liquitex, but I thought they did just fine for what I was doing here. The paints are a little more transparent than some of the Liquitex heavy-body paints that I typically use when I'm painting in acrylics, but I think that also had to do with the fact that I was using like magenta and violet and phthalo blue and some pretty intense colors that don't tend to be transparent anyway. But it didn't affect anything because I was able to get the opacity as I was building up colors. Now see, I went in and fussed with that petal because I felt the shadows were wrong. Go right in. If you see it's not right, it's not going to be right unless you go in there and fix it. Sometimes, we can we can be our worst critic, but then sometimes you got to trust our gut and realize that is not quite right. Now, as I had that practice on all those petals on the first flower, I decided I would do this one kind of in one go. So I put that thick coat of white on every petal at once. Now, I'm doing this because this flower is a little bit behind the first one, and it's not going to be in as sharp a focus, and it's not my focal point. So I don't care if this one's a little bit fuzzier and messier and just kind of pushed back and not as dominant. That's what I want. So by doing that, all in one go, it's going to help me achieve that, and it's going to be time saving as well. Now I have a change. I originally, for some reason, had that flower. I think it's because in my reference photo, the flower from that flower had a petal going over the front one, but then I decided I wanted to push it back later. And again, I will show you how to do that when the time arises. But for right now, I was thinking that that was going to be in front for some reason. But I'm basically doing the same steps, just working a lot quicker. I'm just really making sure I get that magenta in there before that white paint dries, and then kind of blend it out after I've based everything down. You just want to make sure that you give yourself time to work. If you're painting in the desert, this isn't going to fly. You're going to have to do it petal by petal, and you might even need a little bit of like paint retarder in your paint so that it doesn't dry too fast on you. I am here in my main basement in winter. It is cold and damp, and the paint's doing just fine. I actually even had my space heater on, and I was still able to manage this. But you know, you do have to adjust for your climate and for if you're painting outside, you probably couldn't even paint one petal without it all drying on you and not allowing you to blend unless you had some sort of paint retarder in your mix just to keep it wetter longer. I still haven't tried the golden open acrylics. I'm really excited to try them. They're hanging on a peg right next to my work table, so I won't forget about them. But I haven't had a chance to use them yet. But I was really pleased with how I could get things to blend here. I'm going back in with the gray. It's the same mix I used before, and defining some of the petals, giving some shadow, and I'm a lot more expressive with this flower, I think, because I know it's going to not be dominant and I can have some fun with it. And I'm adding that Naples yellow to the bottom centers of the petal to warm them up, and then just re-putting the center stems or center veins, that's it, center veins in the petal. And then I'll go in with some highlights here with some more white, and I'll do my spots last. Am I even going to do spots on this? I don't even know if you'd be able to see the spots from this vantage point. I might actually leave them off on this one. I'll put a little in there. Isn't that funny? It's like I just painted this like 2 days ago, and I can't even remember. This one took a while. Oh, and something else I want to tell you. I'm so sorry I'm talking fast. I don't know why. I just get like, oh, I don't want to forget. Let me tell you this thing. This is how I am in real life. If you talk to anybody that has talked to me in real life, I get really excited, and then I'm always just kind of like, verbal diarrhea. I know. I get all excited. And anyway, the thing that was really interesting about this, and I think we're often in these situations, is where we don't have 2 hours to sit down and paint. We are, picking away at a painting in between doing all the other chores of life. Maybe we're running down to our studio for half an hour before we have to leave for work, or on our lunch break, or after supper. And we're taking these little scraps of time as we have them. And that's how this was painted. This was painted half an hour here, 10 minutes there, 15 minutes there. And it gives you a good perspective when you can step away from your painting like that. I'm doing the stamens here in the center of these flowers using the Naples yellow to base coat them in, and then I'm using spring green at the bottom. This spring green is very similar to permanent green light, maybe with a little bit of white added to it. It's a little bit lighter than typical permanent green light, in case you're matching a different brand at home. And then I'm using some burnt umber to do the little tips there, the tips of the stamen, and it really does stand out quite well. You can add some magenta to that if you feel like your burnt umber is too neutralized or too cold. Sometimes burnt umber is, if you have a raw umber, you're definitely going to want to add that magenta to it to warm it up. I'm adding some of the Naples yellow and spring green and a little bit of white into the bud as well. We've got that lily that's not quite open, and you can't see any of the pink on it yet, so I'm just trying to stay in the shades of green and yellow for that. Now, the leaves on this plant are quite dark, so I wanted to go in and put them in with this nice kind of like midnight green here. And I'm going for pretty much just a good coverage. I'm not really doing any shading and highlighting yet. I'm just kind of basically painting over what I base coated in with the spring green. The stems are a little bit lighter as they're away from the flowers, because the flowers are kind of casting some shadow and they're packed in tight, so they're just not getting the the light as like the bud is, if you look at the open bud, or the not yet open bud, it's getting a lot more light, so the colors are lighter. I am using some of that dark green to define some of the individual petals of the closed bud. And now I'm going in with some of the spring green and a little bit of Naples yellow, and I'm just hitting some of the edges of the leaves and the stem. And what that does is it gives it a highlight, it defines the edges of the leaves, and it makes the stem feel round when you go in and you put that line kind of in the middle of the stem. It gives you a very nice round, feeling to it. It makes it feel like a cylinder kind of. So at this point I'm thinking, boy, that flower is just not standing out as much as I want. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the burnt umber and I am taking one brush and applying it right to the edge of the flower. And then I'm taking another brush that's just damp with water and I am spreading it out. Now I just got some more paint because I was just about out, and you can see how I've added a little water to that to thin it down. So I'm going in with a skinny brush, I'm putting in the paint, taking the larger brush that's damp and spreading it out. So this technique could be called rouging or could be called antiquing. It is kind of more of like a distressing or a rouging because you are adding a shadow that's really soft and blended, but it gives the painting a little harmony because when we stenciled that number 3 in the corner, that we're using that same color brown. It's the same brown we also used for the centers of the flower. It's just a nice way to bring that earthy tone in. Sometimes when you have a lot of really cool colors that are really light and bright and cool, like the teal and the purple and the blue, they can be very difficult colors to work with. They seem to lack that warmth and that fullness that warmer colors have. So this is a good way to bring in that vintage feel and give this nice warm and cozy feeling. The brush I'm using to apply the paint is a 1/4 inch angle brush. Angle brushes are really nice because you have that slope on your bristles. It really lets you tuck in and get into those nooks and crannies that you're trying to paint up against. So I really recommend having one of those small angle brushes in your stash. It's really, really handy. Now I turn my painting around as I'm going because as somebody who's right-handed, I find it easier to kind of stab in with that shadow with the object I'm shading to my left. If you're left-handed, you probably would do the opposite. So work in whatever way is most comfortable for you, and don't be afraid to turn that canvas around. If you're working on an easel, you can just turn it right around in your easel. There's nothing wrong with that. You want to be comfortable. You want to, if you're shaky, use a maul stick, use something so that you can work for a longer period of time without any aches and pains, and you can keep your hands steady. I wanted to bring that shadow also around the leaves and the bud because it just looked kind of weird just having the flowers with that shadow. It just looked very stark otherwise, and it doesn't add any dominance to those leaves, but it does make it feel like it's connected and it works. But sometimes you don't really know if you're going to need to do that until you've already started. And I actually ended up using a little bit of that around the frame of my canvas as well, around the edge of my canvas. So I used to joke that if you did one thing, it was a mistake. If you did something once, it was a mistake. But if you did something many times, it was a design element. And I still think that is true. If you just add that brown in one spot, that could be seen as a mistake or I don't know. But if you keep repeating that, then it becomes part of your design and on purpose. Now what I'm doing here is just covering up my flowers because I want to do some spattering. And I'm just taking a big brush and just kind of hitting it against my hand and giving some spatters. Round brushes will give you larger spatters because they tend to hold a little more paint, and the fewer bristles you have, the shorter your bristles, the less you're going to get for spatter. You can also use a toothbrush for a fine spatter. It's completely up to you. The more you water down your paint, the better your spatters will go. Now another thing I want to use that brown paint for is to stamp on some pattern, and this is a honeycomb stamp, or actually probably more of a chicken wire. It's a hexagon pattern anyway. I made this with my stamp maker many years ago, and it's a really handy little stamp. And what I'm doing here is I am just stamping it and adding to my frame. I'm building that frame up. A design like this is great because they line up, they tessellate, so you can make this as big or as small as you want. You don't have to ink it all the way up to the edge, so you don't have to have it, you don't have to have the edge go exactly the way it does. You can have it break off easier by not putting as much paint on there. But I really like this. This is a really handy little stamp, and you can purchase ones like this, or you can even find like an embossing folder, or even find a piece of chicken wire that you could ink up and press onto your painting. It's you do whatever is handy for you. It doesn't really matter. Any sort of texture like that is going to be useful. Doesn't have to be that particular stamp. And it wouldn't be because, you know, unless you know me personally, I made that stamp in my stamp maker, so it's not like you're going to go to the store and buy it. Now I'm adding some highlights. I'm adding some white on the bud and on the leaves, and that's just going to pull the highlights away from the background. If you didn't have enough, you can tell when you have that shading in there if your highlights need to be stronger. And I also found, just to tint things a little bit, I could use my watercolor pencil, scribble it on my palette paper, and then mix it with some white, and I could use that just to alter my highlight a little bit and not have to get out any more tubes of paint, which is really handy. I did have a little bit of Naples yellow still wet on the front side of my palette paper, so I'm squeezing every last drop out of that because gosh, I hate to waste paint. Don't you hate to waste paint? It seems like such a shame, doesn't it? I like to use every drop whenever I can. As I mentioned before, I used some more brown paint to add to the frame, and as it overlays the violet, you can see you almost get a black vignette effect, and I think it's so pretty and finishes off the painting nicely. I hope you enjoyed this project today. I had so much fun painting it with you, and if you'd like to see the real-time version, you can find it in Critique Club. I'll have a link down below. I hope you find some time today to be creative, and until next time, happy painting!